It's often the case that since not a lot of people understand journalistic principles or how the industry of journalism actually operates, and we're talking about just average people who consume esports content, that there are certain ideas expressed or sentiments held by the community of esports communities like League of Legends, this is a primary one in this story, which just simply are not the case and betray a very naive and actually damaging mindset towards journalists and what journalists are doing. So the primary example that's calling this to mind for me is what's going on at the moment, where ROX Tigers themselves, the organization, the Korean organization, have come out and said that their players are available and that they'll be tendering offers, and they've named basically like half their squad's going to do this. And yet what happened was there was a story where ESPN, Jacob Wolf, the reporter there for ESPN, reported that ROX Tigers would disband after Worlds and that the players had gotten offers from China and the West, and ROX responded and said this was, it was all false. The team had every intention of staying together. This established nothing noteworthy is what they said. Now, the actual issue of that specific case and the details of it is something that I will get to in the future when those players officially sign with other teams, because the day of reckoning for ROX Tigers is not today, sadly, but it will come. Now, as is ever the case, a surprising amount of people came out on the side of the team, because the team themselves came out and said that it wasn't true, and that besides, they had the intention of staying together, and that this wasn't even newsworthy. So a lot of people came out supporting, reiterating what the team organization had said themselves. Now, when I say surprising, I mean as much as if you looked at who benefits from the news and how the news is reported and what the information the public has to go off, you would actually expect that most people would be able to see through what ROX Tigers is doing here and say, well, this is bullshit, and they're just doing this to try and sort of save some sort of face at this point in time, but later on they're going to have to give up the ghost and finally admit that the players are leaving. No, people didn't do that en masse. The general sentiment was like, oh, this is, these articles are bullshit, like I'm sick of these journalists just making shit up and, just guessing at stuff and then taking their guesses and writing it up like a report, and then if it comes true, saying it happened, and if it doesn't, then just being like, oh, well, it was going to change anyway. And the reason why this is a problem is because it happens again and again. It happens in almost every big story where the general trend is if the person that the news is about is more popular than the journalist, so in almost all cases, and it's not a case that directly hurts fans will side with the person who's more famous, who they like more, who they like the accomplishments of. So their logic is, well, I really like ROX Tigers and they seem like they've got a good team spirit and they all seem like a family and they stayed together when they didn't have much money. Therefore, fuck this journalist for lying about the players leaving and just guessing that they're leaving. And also, no, maybe he's like killed a sponsorship deal. All this like nonsense that they have no evidence for these assertions. They don't even have any compelling arguments behind these assertions. They're just stated willy-nilly to the wind without any basis to them, just on the basis, as far as I can tell, that the person likes those players. Now, these people have said that themselves. They've apparently lied, by the way, ROX Tigers. So the general trend is that unless it's something against fans, so unless you like Phantom Lord and people say you conned your fans, unless you like Riot and you're doing something that's fucking over what people want in general, that's the only time people in general will turn against the person who's saying, no, ignore these reports. So think back on old outrages and you'll see this is the way it goes. Now, the problem is, this again brings up the same old anti-journalist sentiments on Reddit. So people who express these simplistic, almost childlike in their naivete, ignorance about the industry of esports and then how journalism is conducted, start spouting off about what a journalist should do and what a journalist's job is and what ethical is and what is ethical rather, and what the impact of a journalist doing the story is. The notion, one of the primary notions, is that if there is some evidence or a source, then it should be named or shown to the public. This makes no sense at all, because if the source and the evidence could be shown to the public, it would not be a report, it would be an article published about it, which would show that it had happened and was happening right now on a literal sense, like a contract is signed, in which case it wouldn't be the same story as like sources say this player will do it. It will be this player has signed with it. So first of all, that can't happen anyway. Secondly, the sources and the evidence cannot be named and shown precisely because it would compromise the source itself. Even if the evidence was shown without the source being shown, they would be able to track back where the evidence had come from, whether it's a Skype log with a player who said it, whether it's actually a piece of a contract, whether it's an email, that fragment that's come from somewhere. It would compromise them. So to get the information out there, you cannot do these things. That is something that cannot happen. And anyone who harps on and on about that does not understand journalism or even the concept of the story we're talking about here. They judge it as though the story says, this has definitely happened. It's already the case. All the evidence is there. I'm just not going to show you. That's not the case at all. The stories we're talking about are not rumors, but sources that are reliable, that can be backed up and verified against other sources, telling someone this is going to happen, or this is what the team is thinking about and planning on doing at this moment. That's all the story tells you. So when the community also says they want the source's name and they want the evidence, what makes the community entitled to that information? The community has already gained by hearing the information itself, that this team's thinking about it, that this will probably happen, that these are the teams the person might go to. And those sources, well, the reports from them are entirely valid, almost certainly valid. Therefore, the community has already gained information they would otherwise not have had. That is all the community is going to get. Not least because the community wants the sources so that they can judge if it's real and if the person is a liar who's the journalist, and then decide whether or not to stop attacking the journalist. Now, the community are not the judge and jury of the journalist. They do not know what information he has access to. They do not know what's going on in the scene to know if he's lying or not. They have no basis to make these judgments, and yet their sentiment is like, show us it or I'll call you a liar. That's not a reasonable way to behave. Now, since it's information that can't be revealed, we are relying, the primary cause of why the story is noteworthy is not just the story, because true, anyone, just a random person could make a blog and write up a post about, Faker's going to leave SK Telecom, probably go to TSM. Anyone could do that, but the point is, unless he showed us the evidence, we wouldn't be able to know he was telling the truth, right? But there's another way. What if he was a journalist and was held accountable by his position in the industry, journalistic ethics, publishing standards, his peer group, and also his whole reputation rode on the line? So his reputation before showed that he'd had many stories and that there was a level of truth to them, and no one had ever come out and shown that they were false, or shown that there was no basis to them and never forced his hand in that way, or shown that he'd fabricated a story. And then as a result, what we're really trusting in this scenario is not the evidence, which we don't get to see. We're trusting the reputation of the journalist. I personally, as a journalist, do not need to know whether or not his source is real or whether or not the information is real. I do not have to check it. And in fact, I would not go to the person and ask them, show me your stuff, because that might compromise it in itself to show me. What I trust is the process of how journalism works in this sense, in terms of ethics and being held accountable. So if in fact it turned out that this journalist had fabricated it and lied and made up the story, that would come out down the line, and certainly would be a story that someone else like me could break, that in itself would be its own story and get hits and attention. And in doing so, people from in the industry would destroy that individual and their reputation, correctly so, by putting it in the position it should be in. So if it came out it was false or fabricated, then the consequences would be enormous. Like, I would come out against him, his peer group would come out against him, people at his site would come out against him. And not only would his reputation be ruined, but the reputation of the website he writes for will be ruined. So ESPN in this case, or for other writers, the Score Esports. And the key detail here is, then people lose faith in ESPN. Therefore, it's on ESPN to help watchdog and monitor this player as well. Therefore, he has in many cases shown his sources to his editor, and his editor has verified this is legit. So you've got two people that you can trust there who are going on record essentially in putting the story out. Also, if he fabricated it entirely and it was ever found at a big site like ESPN it was fabricated, there could even be legal repercussions. There could actually possibly be some kind of lawsuit suing, like libel laws put out against the person. There's also the fact that if it was actual bullshit, like really the players were definitely staying and they'd never spoken to that person, then I know from the way the industry works, the org in question who were being cited would go to other journalists and give them information to write counter stories. This is a fabricated story, it's not the case. Here's proof. Here's some letters of intent that they plan to sign again. Here's a conversation that was leaked that shows the player saying he wants to sign again. They could do all these things. Now, the orgs don't do that. They just publicly say the person's lying because they want to smear their name. They want to get fans on their side. They don't want to actually show it and make a compelling case and use the methods of journalism. Yet, when they're in the case where they have that information, I can tell you, they do use the methods of journalism. They do reach out to reporters. In fact, what's funny is most leaks come from other orgs and other players, and they themselves will get mad when it's their org being reported on, their players get reported on, but they will leak the information themselves to others to ruin their rivals, to try and put the information out there about their rivals and spoil their surprise and let everyone know what's going on in that sense. Or they're cheesed off that they didn't get the player and then they want to publicly out it. This is how most leaks happen. So everyone's saying, well, the leaks obviously came from inside the org. You don't know what you're talking about. You have no idea what you're talking about in this sense. So, to my knowledge, there have never been any stories by Richard Lewis or Jacob Wolf or any other prominent esports journalist who breaks stories, does investigative journalism, that were shown to be fabricated and that were false. This has never happened. No one's ever come out with any compelling reasons to show that this was the case or that they fabricated it. And after the fact, orgs will often even admit years later that certainly they were thinking about this player, etc., and they'll forget their own lies. It's like that famous thing of if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember as much. You don't have to keep track of your lies. Now, you can disagree with the interpretation of the facts by these journalists, but the facts were always accurate and were always newsworthy and were of interest to the public and things that people are interested in, like where's a big name player going to go? So when Reddit also does this other thing where people on Reddit claim, oh, the news just came from Reddit, you just saw rumors on Reddit and then reported them. Now, the reason why that works is because Reddit just names a million sources. I've seen people make suggestions like, oh, this player will go to this team because, you know, they'd play together well. And I actually know personally behind the scenes those two players hate each other. Or I know that they once tried to sign that player and it didn't work out and he'll never go to that team. So they're just throwing darts at a board and just hoping that they accidentally hit the treble 20. Now, when they throw loads and loads and loads of darts, hundreds of darts, if one of them comes vaguely near the treble 20, they can't go, see, my accuracy is really good. Same thing that this reporter did. Because the reporter doesn't just throw loads of darts. He finds out the story, then he verifies it with more than one source, and then he goes around the scene and he tries to check everything's correct. Then he publishes the story. So even if in some extreme world he got the rumor from the normal scene, which almost never happens, it goes the other way. People hear things from the people that he heard them from or from the journalist himself, and then they propagate the rumor. Then in that scenario, even then, he still does the journalistic work to make it a newsworthy story. A rumor, just by anyone thought up in their brain, is not a newsworthy story. But an article that actually has gone and verified it and found people are willing to go on record, well, off record, obviously, in that sense, but give them the real information, is noteworthy, is newsworthy, and it's very different, and there's a key distinction to be made there. So there's also the fact that it's a report at that time. All the report says is at this time, this is the case. The player's thinking of moving, he's likely to move, these are the possible locations. That's all that matters. It never has to be borne out by happening later. But happening later doesn't prove that, rather it not happening later doesn't prove that it wasn't the case at that time. The report is for this time. There will be a separate news article when it actually happens or something else happens. So it's irrelevant to put the time context in like people do here and try and judge it in that fashion. Again, that's people wanting to play judge and jury where they have none of the information and no belief system or qualification to be able to judge it. They have no qualitative experience to know how to even judge something like that. Now, the notion that it hurts organizations to have this information out there, boo fucking who? That's irrelevant. It doesn't matter how the org feels, whether they don't want it, whether this would mess with a business deal of theirs. I mean, think about that for a second. So people are angry that this might mess with a business deal that the org would get. So let's just check this. So the players are going to leave an org. That org is going to lose its primary asset, the players, because if it gets a bunch of scrubs out of solo queue, it's not the same org. And someone might be about to invest millions into the org, thinking as the org wants them to, that they'll still have those players. Then they'll invest millions. You think that's reasonable to purposely con someone by hiding information from them that could be known that might help them make a better business deal and go and invest somewhere else? I don't think that's ethical. So actually, I think the fans who are saying that's an incredibly childish way to think, and you haven't thought through the ethical implications and consequences of those statements that you're making in that sense. People who are investors should absolutely have more information. In fact, they should have more information than the public. They should have private information and get good consultants who, by the way, would already have access to these rumors anyway and would tell them whether the report came out or not. So it's also another scenario. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. As soon as it's leaked in the community, it's already out there. It doesn't matter whether someone actually reports on it, which they will, or whether it just gets to the investor another way anyhow. So there's also the fact that, as I said, the information is already out there before the report's done. Other players have heard it. Other teams have heard it. So it's not like the journalist is the first point, because remember, he then has to verify it, which takes longer than the word just spreading out around the scene. Now, leaks often do not come from the player, as I said. So even if the player and the org say that's not true, that's actually irrelevant because they can be lying. Now, in this scenario, we know the journalist has done his homework and has verified it, and that his sources aren't lying to him, because guess what? If his sources lie to him, he also then will abandon them as sources and will not work with them as sources again. So they have to have their veracity as well, have their position that's at stake. And by the way, he could, in theory, himself give off some information where that person could be fucked over in the future. So if those orgs come out and say this stuff and later are shown to be liars, there should be consequences. Now, I'll do another video about this or an article or something, because I think we need to start holding these orgs accountable. I've seen too many orgs lie about things that definitely happened, were always happening. I even knew privately happened. Sometimes they even privately told me were happening, yet they've still smeared journalists. So it's time there was a database. It's time there was a way to hold these people accountable, and you can look up an org and see every time they lied and on what transfers. And one day, I don't know how that's going to come about, but there's something like this for games journalism, and I think it should exist, and I'm looking to see if it can be a possibility. So, final point I want to make is, all this furore and name calling and finger pointing and ethical, furrowing of the brow, and people giving sermons about what's right and what's wrong and what you should and shouldn't do, who have no idea about any of this stuff, by people who have no knowledge of journalistic principles or how the esports industry works to have a sense of whether it's likely or not, spouting off, and for what? For a report about something that might happen. That's it. And that at the time is accurate in that he has sources that tell him this might happen, and there's a basis to believe it's accurate. A report of something that might happen. Not that it will happen, not that it's definitely going to happen, not that it's going to happen because I made this article now. No, just a source that at that moment gives people information that this is actually what people are thinking. And that's what people are getting upset about. Absolutely pathetic response by the public.